We're here together because we have envisioned a future where our children and future generations can thrive in a cleaner, safer, and more just world. A world where we don't have to choose between economic development and saving the planet. A world where everyone knows that these two concepts must go hand in hand.
Juan Verde, welcome to the show. It's a very great honor to have you here. I will put you in gallery view. Juan, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
You have analyzed this crisis from many angles, and you have participated in a lot of live interviews, and I have watched some of yours. What is your opinion? What are the lessons that the world needs to learn from this crisis, as scientists have warned us long before about the imminence of a pandemic? Even President Barack Obama spoke about it, even Bill Gates spoke about it, yet we were not ready for this kind of amplitude of economic shock. So what kind of lessons can we learn from this?
There are many lessons, and I truly believe that this is a very disruptive moment in history. Nothing will ever be the same. There will be a before and after this coronavirus crisis. Having said that, there are many lessons that can and should be learned by the international community. The number one, in my opinion, is the fact that we should have listened to the scientific community. We should have listened to those voices, some of them very important, validated voices, such as President Obama, or even Bill Gates when he gave a TED speech, which was actually viewed by more than 18 million people around the world, even before the crisis. But there were many voices that were telling us, and have been telling us for the last 30 years, that a pandemic of this sort was not that it was possible, but that it was going to happen. And yet we were not prepared. Yeah. So I think the lesson number one is that there will be other crises like this one in the near future, and that we must be prepared. There's a lot more we should have done. And therefore, I think going forward, number one, we must listen to the scientific community, particularly when it comes to other potential dangers such as climate change. According to many scientists, we should be more worried about climate change and the environmental catastrophes that are coming our way than this crisis. This crisis is very, very severe. It's going to be extremely dangerous, but we'll get through it. We'll get through it, and whether it's 3 months from now, 3 months later, we'll get through it, and we'll go back to some degree of normality. The question here is, what are the learned lessons? And I think that we walk away understanding that the scientific community is warning us about potential future crises of this nature.
The scientists have been warning about the climate change for decades, but still we are not listening. So what are leaders missing on these threats, on these attention marks from the scientists? So we are seeing now the impact of a virus. What is the impact, the immediate impact of climate change? Where should they pay attention?
That's absolutely true. The scientific community has been talking to us for over 30 years about the grave and absolute danger of climate change. And we're not listening once again. And not to take away importance from this present crisis is the tragedies are numerous, and there are a lot of people suffering out there. But when you actually look at the data, I think it's quite surprising to learn that according to the World Bank, for example, this year alone, there will be anywhere between 6 and 7 million premature deaths caused by climate change. As a direct result of climate change, about 6 to 7 million people will die this year. Just this year alone, we should have, in addition to this coronavirus, an extra 19 to 21 million climate change refugees in the world. And according to the IMF, by 2030, we should expect about 100 million people to go into extreme poverty as a direct result of climate change. The only difference versus the current crisis is that it's not happening all at once. This is happening over time. But at this point, we can no longer ignore the fact that this is extremely, extremely important. There is a difference between the present danger of the coronavirus and the ongoing danger of climate change, but they're both equally destructive to our economy and to the sustainable future.
But during these times, we can look at the very close link between coronavirus crisis and the environmental change crisis. We have seen a drop of pollution, the improvement of air quality, and yes, the general betterment of the environment. So there's absolutely a close link. How should governments, how should companies adapt their strategies to get out of this crisis as best as possible, and create a better future with less pollution, because pollution is causing more victims than coronavirus. So we should pay a lot of attention into that direction, into changing the policies and the business models. What do you suggest?
Well, I think the answer to that question is a combination of what we can do as individual citizens and what governments can do. As individual citizens, I think there are two ways to really have a meaningful impact, and that is the way in which we shop and the way in which we vote. And those are perhaps the most important things we could do. If we are willing to reward and or punish the companies that are responsible with the environment and that are offering healthy, sustainable products, I think we can have a direct impact on our economy. But at the end of the day, I'm an environmentalist with a last name like Verde, which means green. You know where I stand on this. But as an environmentalist, I don't really care whether you are vegan or whether you have an electric car. But I do really care as to how you vote. We must be willing to vote for those elected officials that are, one, smart enough to understand and listen to the science, and number two, are brave enough to make decisions that might not be popular, but that are absolutely necessary if we want to avoid these types of crises in the world in the future, and if we want to do the right thing going forward, particularly for the next generations. So individually, how you vote and how you purchase or what you purchase. But at the end of the day, the reason why I say that I don't particularly care about individual, and again, it's very important what you do, but at the end of the day, the change that is necessary at this point is systemic, drastic change, and that only comes from governments and multilateral entities. We must do a lot more to make sure that governments understand what's at stake here, and that we all understand that there is a lot for us to win if we work together as nations and as people of the world, and a lot to lose if we don't. This crisis has shown us that global problems require global solutions and global approaches. We cannot longer think that a crisis such as the coronavirus is something that we could actually control in our own borders without the cooperation and collaboration of others. And the same thing applies to climate change. This is a planetary level crisis, and it will require cooperation from all the countries of the world. So those are the two things I think are extremely most important: how we vote, how we purchase, therefore who we reward and who we punish with our own individual actions.
This would have been one of my future questions about the leaders, the quality of leaders that we should look at. How should the future generation of leaders look like? What are the traits? What should we look for?
Yeah. one of the takeaway lessons from the coronavirus is that in the case of China, for example, the approach was dictatorial almost, where the government made decisions that were not questioned and that were not that were actually extremely effective if you think about it, because people were not allowed to question or to go against the government. So while I'm not suggesting that we move in that direction, I am saying that in Western democracies, for example, politicians are still thinking about the next elections and not necessarily about the next generations. That needs to change. I think that politicians need to understand that they will be voted out if they don't do the right thing. They are there to make decisions for the next generations, always first and foremost. And if they're not willing to do that, they should not be in the business of governing. We as voters have a big responsibility to make sure that they understand that. And the most effective way to do that is to actually go out there and vote, but perhaps as importantly, to also be active. And by that, I mean community organizing. By that, I mean a greater participation in civic society and a greater participation when it comes to the election and electoral system, particularly in the United States.
Exactly. Yeah, this is a model most practiced in the United States. I live in Romania, where social activism is not very popular, but we are quite a young democracy. Can you give us a few examples of what it means to be an active citizen?
To me, an active citizen is someone who it's not passive when it comes to what happens around them, around him or around her. What do I mean by that? You could be active by posting information that it's important to you, picking up the phone and talking to your colleagues at work, your friends and family members, or perhaps participating in a protest around the issue of Earth Day, which happened recently, and being informed about what politicians want to do. Do they understand what keeps me awake at night? Are they willing to make tough decisions that are not popular, but that are absolutely necessary if we want to change the world? And so I think the first thing you can do is be informed, care. That I always say that political apathy is a cancer. It's an illness because in a lot of young democracies, people believe that their individual vote or individual actions are not going to change anything. And the moment you think that, you lost. You lost because then those people that are now making the wrong decisions will continue to govern and continue to be your elected officials. So be active, be informed. And if you have to, and you don't like the choices you have of the people that are running for office, then perhaps you should run for office. By that, I mean, get involved, whether it's helping somebody else get involved, getting somebody else get elected, or take a step forward and do it yourself.
It's true. I would like to ask you about innovation, because it's one of the topics that you promote a lot, and of course it's closely connected to climate change and the use of green technologies to be implemented by states and by companies, the adoption of green technologies and stimulation of innovation. How do you see that accelerating, especially during these times after we get out of the corona crisis? How should we focus more on stimulating innovation in order to accelerate change?
Very good question. Whether we like it or not, we're about to embark into a long and very difficult economic recovery process. According to most experts, the economic crisis that is coming, it will be worse than the Great Depression of 1936. If anything, it would be more similar to the world economy during World War II in the nations that were actually in the middle of a war. That's the type of economic distress that the world will be under. That's the bad news. The good news is that billions, if not trillions of dollars will be spent in the upcoming years for us to recover, economically speaking. that it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to build and design a more sustainable, more innovative, and perhaps more competitive world. Let me give you an example. We're going to be subsidizing most likely airlines, and we're going to have to be subsidizing hotels and companies from the tourism industry, which has been very affected by this crisis. If we are willing to do that, and we should help certain strategic sectors of our economy for them to create jobs and survive. But if we're going to do that, we should take advantage of that opportunity to make sure that we also implement and that we demand, actually, that those companies, once they get public funds, they're willing to do a transition in their own strategic plans so that they become more energy efficient, so that they implement innovation and technology in their own strategic plans, that they think of contingency plans for the future. For example, if you're an airline, perhaps you should have a timeline for the next 5 to 10 years to switch over to less harmful fuels and for you to be a lot more responsible. If you do that as an airline, you'll be more competitive. You'll use technology and create jobs and create economic activity, but at the same time, you'll be doing the right thing with the planet, the right thing with the citizens, the right thing with the employees. It's a win-win all around it. So again, to answer your question, as we think of economic recovery plans for countries, for regions, and even for the world, we must be willing to demand that companies do the right thing. Is the ethical and the competitive thing to do.
This is also the mindset of the citizens, which should be demanding from the states and the companies the right thing to do and stimulate the buying of the products and services from the responsible and sustainable companies.
Yeah, but I'm not proposing that we don't bet on economic recovery. I'm not suggesting that we don't inject public funds into the economy. What I am saying is that if you're going to give the money away, make sure that the companies understand that it's not free money, that something must be paid back to society in return for those funds. And thinking of a brighter, more sustainable future is also an ethical way of being good citizens and good companies. But sometimes you don't even have to think of new technologies that are going to change the world, whether it's innovation or breakthrough disruptive technologies of the future. Many times it's just understanding that many of those technologies are now available. Let me give you an example. If we now know one thing is that working from home works. According to the last article I read last night, about 1.3 billion people are now working from home successfully around the world because of this crisis. We've always had the technology, but a lot of companies refuse to implement it. Some of them refuse to allow the employees to work from home. I think this crisis has shown that 1, it works, 2, it's effective, and 3, it does also make employees happier, better citizens. They pollute less, they have more quality of life, more time with their family members, and the efficiency of the employees does not go down. So why not implement that technology into the future economic model? We should do that because it makes perfect economic sense, but it's also good for the environment and it's good for society. Those are the types of examples that I've been referring to when I say that we must care about what and how we spend public money.
It's true. And also the working from home can stimulate the urbanization of areas we haven't thought before. Like people would stay more in the countries, there will be less migration of talent. The talent would stay in their country, pay taxes in the same place and stimulate the sustainable development of urban areas, which didn't have this chance before. So there are a lot of good perspectives on this crisis.
Absolutely. And it's going to force us to have to rethink urban development. It's going to force us to rethink whether we should concentrate our companies in the downtown areas, for example. I think Romania in particular stands to win a lot. The Romanian economy, it's well known for having very well trained and very well educated employees. and they can now work from anywhere in the world. I mean, they can work from Romania and offer their services to other companies around the world. As technology becomes more available, we'll begin to see that transfer of knowledge and funds from country to countries. They'll be looking for the best human capital, regardless of where it is. And this is one of the takeaway lessons from this crisis.
It's true. There are also other technologies coming, breakthrough technologies. We're at the brink of a technological revolution, which is going to absolutely transform the world as we know it, even more than we are seeing right now. So it's AI coming, blockchain, AR, VR, robotics, digital medicine, digital biology, and all of these things which are going to transform the world as we know it. Big data is also a big thing that governments can use and companies in order to respond to global crises like we are seeing now with this pandemics. How can big data and new technologies can be used in order to prevent natural disasters and to control them better, to respond better to these kinds of events?
I think that one of the takeaway lessons from this crisis is that the world will have to think about how it prioritizes investments and public expenditure. We are going to see an exponential growth when it comes to investments in R&D and innovation, technologies that are going to and are actually currently changing the world will be accelerated. And I think that's a great opportunity. One of those technologies is big data. A lot of people think that big data is associated with losing privacy or perhaps something that we should not be pursuing. Big data can be positive, and particularly when it comes to public policy and when it comes to big political decisions. Again, a lot of these politicians like Donald Trump, for example, or Bolsonaro in Brazil, or even the president of Mexico, they're making short-term popular decisions, not really understanding what the science is telling them. If the science is telling you that people should stay at home and that if you don't, your healthcare system will collapse, we should listen to that. We should listen to them because they're not driven by political interest, but rather they want to save lives. And if we know one thing is that the data is available, and that if you analyze and interpret the data in an objective way, as a politician, you should be rewarded in the next elections for making the right decisions. But again, that requires political will, and it requires politicians to be thinking about the next, as I mentioned before, the next generations and not the next elections. I remain confident and optimistic about the role of big data going forward. But even beyond big data, at the end of the day, it's science. It's listening to the people that know more than you do, and not trying to think that you know it all.
Digital transformation, big data, everything is linked to having access to better decision making in the end. Digital transformation together with circular economy can reshape the economy. What is your standpoint on circular economy?
Circular economy, it's basically a concept that says that we should go back to listening to our grandparents. If you think about your grandmother, just a generation ago, people thought about ways of recycling, ways of reusing, and ways of cutting back on waste, right? The circular economy proposes that we should be thinking about what we produce and the entire life cycle of those products, and that the best, most efficient way is for those products to be reused, to recycle, and for us to consume less, or at least to consume the absolute necessary and not more than that. One of the lessons of this crisis is that most countries will have to go back to self-efficiency when it comes to a number of very strategic sectors. It doesn't make any sense for the United States to have, for some medical products and some pharmaceutical products, 90 to 95% of the production being made in China. We're now having a very interesting scenario where countries are fighting in the international markets, looking for face masks and looking for respirators and looking for medical equipment, because the supply, the world supply chain, it's not efficient. And we're still very, very dependent on a number of countries around the world. That will change. We'll begin to see, after this crisis, most countries, particularly Europe and the United States, will promote and even subsidize more local production in certain sectors. We should think about the circular economy as the way to frame that new economic model. What we can produce locally, we should produce it locally, if it makes economic sense, of course. But there are strategic sectors like food, like medicines, and like medical equipment that it has to be guaranteed that to a certain degree it's still done locally. This is the tremendous opportunity for the circular economy, because it allows you to be more economically competitive and to do the right thing with the environment and to do the right thing with the citizens of the planet.
Besides the circular economy model, what else do you see as the post-corona new economic model? How will it be shaped? By which values?
I think that we should remain optimistic about the new world that will be rebuilt from this crisis. I am absolutely convinced that this is an opportunity for companies, for countries, to begin to do things in a different way, but more importantly, to understand that not everything is valid, that you cannot continue to destroy the planet and not think of the short-term consequences, and that if you do, you should pay for it. You should pay the consequences. That those that pollute should have to pay for the pollution they generate, for example. And I say that because I think most people will have to understand that capitalism as we know it today is dead. The new economic model, I think, will be based on capitalism and free markets, but it will be very different. It will have a more social component. People will be willing to not necessarily save every penny when it comes to public spending, that they might have to pay more for things such as public health, public health care, or good hospitals, or for having certain strategic sectors of your economy protected, so that if and when this happens again, we'll be in a much better situation. But I think the overall theme here is that we're looking at a new economic model that will be more socially responsible and a lot more sustainable. Is the right thing to do.
Juan, thank you very much for your input, for your conclusions. I would like to ask you in the end, if you have a book recommendation, a book that has impacted you a lot, that has changed your perspective, your view of the world.
It's a good question. And 2 months ago, I would have given you a very, very different answer. I probably would have thought of any one of those best economic bestsellers that I could recommend. But to me, having been in lockdown system with my kids for the last almost 40 days has also changed what I read. And I'm actually rereading The Little Prince. And it's a book that is full of meaningful, life-changing messages that are quite simple. And it's not just good for kids. I think that's a book I would recommend. A very popular book. I think I read it, decades and decades ago. I'm reading that book to my kids, and I highly recommend it. This is the time to think about the future, not only when it comes to what's economically right and sound, but also what is spiritually right. We need a very different world, and the world that the Little Prince talks about.
Juan, thank you very much. It has been a great pleasure for me, and to hear your opinions about how to build a world, a legacy for the future generations, not only how to recover from this event. Juan, thank you. Lots of good luck.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.